once again, thank you all. And let's see here. All right. So as far as today goes, was looking forward to chatting a little bit about flexibility, but also strength within flexibility. So I'm a sucker for rhymes and alliteration, so length with strength, right? Long and strong. I feel like it sits well with the kiddos. So so we'll talk a little bit today about, sort of the generally kind of quickly talk about the mechanisms that are present with stretching and what does that mean with strength and length. We'll kind of ebb and flow between some of the exercises that we often give our dancers, and these may be ones that you also utilize. And then I think to perhaps tie everything together, making the conversation more about like how we're perhaps explaining these concepts to our younger dancers. And I'd love to share and also hear from you all about some of the strategies that you have used, that you have found effective, where dancers are like, oh yes, okay, now when I think of stretching, it's not just, doing the thing, but that there is a little bit of purpose behind it. I think we try to set our dancers up with ideas and concepts that when they approach movement in the future, they can begin to think more about how they're, at the very root of it, warming up, but also how they are training, and perhaps in some ways what they're being told about what's happening during their training. So right off the top of my head, some things that I really like to mention, and we'll probably focus on like hamstrings a little bit today, a little bit more than other things, because I think it's a perfect example of how movement can differ depending on position. So, what does it mean to have strength with length, but strength for endurance, but strength with length, but strength for speed, right? AKA quick punches. And then also looking at what perhaps like what some expectations are, and this is probably more anecdotal, but there are some things that we like to have dancers do and understand that they can do, which are, with some of our hamstring slider activities. It's like, hey, can you do 5 of these in 3 different directions and do it without feeling like you're struggling through? And if you can do that, I will say, anecdotally speaking, in our experience, they seem to be in a good place. At least those that have maintained that ability to perform that exercise have not returned to us with hamstring injuries. So, so yes. So let's see. And then I'd like to talk a little bit more about some progressions and regressions and different ways we can think about flexibility, mobility, as well as how we're sort of preparing to control these spaces. And then we'll also tie everything back to our R.A.M.P warm-up. So raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate. I think once again that framework has allowed for, not just a good warm-up, but it's a good framework to return to when educating dancers about the qualities needed for dance. So last week we talked a little bit about agility, and I feel like you can kind of insert agility principles into each one of those little segments of raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate, but you can also think of the same thing, I think, with muscles and lengthening, but strengthening. Yes. So really quick, I'm just kind of interested, when we are talking with our students about flexibility and range of motion, what are some ways that seem to be salient with those that we work with? I think for me, it's more about being able to describe, like, if you have, once again, going back to the hamstring situation, I really like to say, like, okay, if you can slide out all the way, but if it's hard for us to slide back, or that we're struggling with that a little bit, then I think for me, that's a perfect opportunity to demonstrate through movement to say, hey, look, you have the length, but do you have the strength to, you know, pull back up? And I think that sits well with the dancers because it gives them a movement to focus on, and it's a very simple movement, generally speaking, and it's something that they can, you know, if they remember, that they can do. It's kind of like, oh, can you do your 30 heel raises? And if they can't, then it's like, well, that's a life goal, right? Yeah. Any thoughts from your ends? And if not, that's okay.
Yeah, I always tell the kids I work with that, you know, I'm like, if you can control it, that's always best, especially because I teach a lot of Pilates. So it's all, you know, control is like the name of the game. And I'm always like, if you can't control it, it doesn't count, basically. You know, I'm like, if you can actively get there, that's where we're trying to get to. Like the passive part, yeah, sure, you can stretch passively and hang out there all day, but you know, what are you using to get there? And I just kind of try to keep hammering that in. It's like, you want, like, you know, active, usable range is always going to be the best. And that actually, I don't know, I feel like they connect with that and they're like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
like on the flip side too, like working with, so you kind of touched on like maybe kids who have the flexibility but don't have the strength. But for the kids that have the strength but don't have the flexibility, like kind of talking about the brain's involvement with controlling flexibility and saying, like, you know, if I put you under sedation, I could take your leg and put it behind you because your brain wouldn't be in control of that at that time. So we have to teach the body that it has the strength so it feels safe enough to go into those ranges. And so by building that strength, we can let the body know, like, I have the control to go further, and that's when we can start to see that flexibility like gains for some kids that like where the flexibility is maybe not coming naturally. That might be part of it, that they need that strength component for the body to feel safe to let go of some of that flexibility.
Why are you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. I think that involvement of the brain is huge because once again, at the base of it, and this is something that I also like to say to our dancers is like, oh, you know, what is, you know, we have our muscles, but like what actually moves it? What controls like our ability to lengthen and contract and things like that? They're like, oh, the brain. I'm like, so what if I told you that it's your brain that's not allowing things to extend, right? And I think it really kind of, well, two things. One, it introduces a different idea of like perhaps like how to train, and then or like what's happening, that they're not just like passively pulling on muscles. And then two, I think it gives a different perspective of flexibility and training flexibility in terms of allowing the body to reach a certain position instead of trying to force it. Because I mean, physiologically, you're talking about at some point desensitization of the muscle reflexes themselves. So it feels, as Becca, as you said, like safe to go into these ranges of motion. Safe because you know you can control it, right? So
I like that too because I was gonna say I like that too because I feel like a lot of like traditional ballet kind of almost puts you against your own body. It's kind of like you end up having kind of an antagonistic relationship with your body. Like, why won't it do this? I just need to push harder. But that kind of shifting that a little bit, you're working with your body to get there instead of like just trying to bully your body into that.
Yes, yeah, that whole idea of, I think, permission is huge. And if we want to get into, you know, the social and cultural constructs of dance, you know, permission is often not a word that is used, I feel. So it's nice to, once again, introduce that idea of like, hey, I can allow my body to be in certain positions and I can have ownership of certain positions. Therefore, I can, you know, make the artistic choices that I am choosing to make. Yes. So really quick, just a general acknowledgement of just what flexibility kind of is in our community. Obviously, it is something that is very desired in the youth dance learning population. And of course, a lot of it is compounded by the idea of like visual spectacle, you know, had to have like a competitive edge, and obviously there is the wow factor too. Social media doesn't help, and then health and wellness trends, you know, on the good exposure to health and wellness ideas, of course, allow for people like ourselves to talk with people, but then we just have to recognize there is also the other end of the spectrum, right? A lot of, no judgment, but a lot of what the health and wellness community is, well, how do I say this? Let's call it the fitness community, where there are a lot of things that are perpetuated that obviously are not, wouldn't qualify as safe practices, but it gets people results. And so and this is probably something for our discussion, but in my role as a physical therapist and trying to get people well generally is going to be along the lines of like acknowledging that they are going to choose to train the ways that they want to, or that they perceive to be of value to them. So I've actually stepped away a little bit from saying like, don't do this, don't do that. Instead, giving them the autonomy to be like, well, what does that feel like? And does that feel good? And to allow them to make the decision of whether or not they want to continue. And if they make the decision to continue, then I get to have the conversation of like, well, then you better be, if you're creating the space, then you better be developing the ability to, like you said, control that, right? Because if you don't, that's where things happen. So it allows for a more nuanced conversation, which then can get down to perhaps discussion of like individual goals and how they're achieving those goals, and then giving them the ability to choose and to make decisions rather than just me saying, that's bad, don't do it. So larger conversation, yes. And once again, in terms of like what we see in the clinic related to younger humans having the space but not the strength to control, one of the main things that we often see is, once again, like hamstring tendon injuries, as well as like hamstring muscle pull as well, muscle strains, sorry. So, and that, once again, is a good conversation starter of like, you have the length, but do you have the strength? We do see a little bit of, actually, no, we see a little bit. We see a lot of like hip flexor tightness. And so I think there is a great conversation to have about like, well, what exactly is tightness? Because you are not, you know, you are not unflexible. So why does it feel tight, right? And we can dive into the mechanisms a little bit there. Great. Okay, so as far as range of motion is concerned, the two big differentiations, flexibility and mobility. There's a lot of different definitions of what flexibility can be and mobility can be, and this is, once again, a general blanket statement that just allows for better consumption of information with our younger population that we work with. So typically I'll describe flexibility as your more like muscular and like soft tissue, where you're working through like muscles and nerve extensibility. And then mobility is then, you know, maybe focused on joints a little bit more, where you're looking at how much space do I actually have anatomically, and then how do I own that space? Once again, a very gross generalization, but we're going for salience of information here. So, you know, and then you can like dynamic active mobility is then like, well, I guess that means everything, right? Muscle, joint, nerve, control and coordination. And I think, you know, once again, to make it make sense for students, you know, beyond just like stretching muscles or creating range of motion, it's knowing how you're using all of that space that you have. Some general recommendations that people are finding more frequently, or that are a little bit more ubiquitous, is kind of that 30-second mark. They're like, you know, static versus dynamic stretching. And then you are like, before class, don't hold a stretch for, or try to not hold a stretch for more than like 30 seconds, because there's some research out there that talks about like diminishment of power, because if you're lengthening a muscle, then there's obviously like less tension. So then if there's less tension, the body has a harder time perhaps like reading how much tension there is and like when to pull back. And so let's say if someone's about to go do some like crazy jumps, then perhaps, and which does require a measure of muscle tension, then the recommendation, of course, is like, well, you're not going to hold a stretch there, because then you lose that quick ability to respond. And then as far as like static stretching goes, there was a long time where everyone was saying like, don't static stretch. That's like the worst thing ever. But there's also research that says in order to efficiently lengthen muscles, static stretching is the way to go. So lots of different parameters here, but typically I still recommend our dancers to go, to keep it dynamic even in those moments. But that's when you would hold for like more than 30 seconds. And I think some ways that we can also like describe things to our dancers is like, oh, does this feel like a stretch in the muscle, or is this something that you feel that is a bony block? And so if it's a bony block, especially in the hips, they're like, oh, I just get here and I just can't go anymore. Then that's an opportunity to have a conversation about everyone's hips are different. You know, different hip shapes are going to require different positions. So depending on the situation, let's say they're working with a coach, if you will, and they are saying like, oh yeah, when I'm in this stretch, it doesn't feel like my muscles are stretching. It feels like I'm just like hitting something in the front of my hip. It feels deep and it feels probably a little sharp and it feels like a block. Then that's a moment to say, well, maybe you can't stretch muscles right now in that position because of where your hips are shaped. We talk about the ball and socket. We talk about how it can, you know, hit the labrum and things like that. So once again, a nice sort of movement experience to relate back to something anatomical that they can then begin to perhaps be more aware of where their physicality is. Great. Okay. Let's, I think I'm just going to preface this and say that I think our movement session will be a little longer than our discussion session today, because there are definitely some things I want to be able to cover. But let's talk a little bit about that idea of length with strength again. So on the physical muscle component, we have what we are called the muscle spindles in the muscle, and that's basically what reads like quick contractions, and if it senses the quick lengthening of the muscle, and then it wants to promote a muscle contraction. It's a protective mechanism. And so when we talk about stretching, it's like in some ways we're desensitizing these muscles to allow for length. A great example would be if if a dancer is going to a battement, and this is actually something else, a dancer I was working with, where she had the length, she could, you know, hold her leg super high, but every time she went to a battement, she couldn't keep her knee straight. And so she was focusing on quad strengthening like crazy, and was like, oh, like this is something that just like wasn't helping at all. So our conversation became about, well, if you're kicking your leg up really fast, what's slowing you down? It's your hamstrings that are, once again, trying to protect everything from going too fast. That's a perfect example of knee bent in a battement. But then you're like, okay, so what does that mean? And that means that, you know, once again, gross generalization for the sake of understanding. If I have to kick my leg really fast, my hamstring is stretching really fast. And if my hamstring isn't used to stretching that fast with that length, with that speed, perhaps it's trying to protect. And so what we did was we worked on a few like actually hamstring like RDLs, but like going past the 90 degree. So then, and educating them on like, hey, this is now your hamstring is used to, you know, coming into this space, work a little faster. And then we went back to her battements, and once again, she was able to perform it a little better. But also that sensation of tightness is like reduced, right? Tightness as a sensation, I think, is important to communicate to our dancers as well, like rather than necessarily like a physical state that needs to be manipulated, shall we say. Yeah. Okay. Let's do this. Let's move.